All right, people of the internet, it's time we've had a little talk. The talk about the network attached storage solution. Are you one of the many who's become comfortable and complacent with just plugging a USB drive into the back of your router? Or perhaps you went out to Best Buy, got yourself an external hard drive that plugs into your network and you feel hip and connected. But for those of us that are more advantageous, for those of us that demand expandability, plugins, and just plain things to tinker with, there's the home server running FreeNAS. Now, I've been running this server for about 10 years in various states with various operating systems until I stumbled across FreeNAS back in version 9. Blew my mind. The amount of options, plugins, expandability, everything that's built right into this freely available open source software really kind of changed the game for my home network. And that was quite a few years ago. Things have changed quite a bit, and this hardware is getting quite dated. So my plan was, hey, I'm going to upgrade from RAID 5 to RAID 10, replace the motherboard, processor, and memory. And since everything's so drastic and I have to start the software over from scratch, I figured you guys might be interested in coming along for the ride. Setting up a server at home running FreeNAS has a lot of benefits. You can do different user accounts, many different plugins, media plugins, surveillance plugins, download plugins. Not only that, it's just fun to do. So let's move on over to the office and start downloading some software.
Okay, before we get started, there's a couple of things we got to look into. Number one, we've got to confirm that the hardware we plan on using at least meets the minimum requirements needed for FreeNAS. Now at the time of recording, they're up to version 11.3. So let's take a look on their page. They're calling for a multi-core 64-bit processor, an operating system drive with at least 8 gigabytes of storage, 8 gigabytes of system RAM, and at least one hard disk for storing data. Now these specifications are more than enough if all you're looking to do is have a few network drives at home. But if you're looking to do something a little bit more hardware intensive, say host a media server at home, or use any of the other advanced plugins that you can get with FreeNAS, I would recommend trying to hit a little bit closer to the recommended minimum hardware. Now the big differences between the bare minimum and the recommended minimum is that they're asking for a little bit more storage space on the operating system drive, a little bit extra system RAM, 2 drives so you can at least have a mirror so you have some data safety there, and that they're asking for ECC RAM. I absolutely recommend ECC RAM. This stands for error correcting code, and this helps make sure that there's no bad bits or bad parities in the RAM that eventually gets wrote onto your data drives. Now ECC RAM is really a great thing for home users as long as you're not on the cutting edge. So I was able to pick up a couple of generations old Supermicro server motherboard, an Intel Xeon quad core with 8 threads, 12 gigabytes of ECC RAM all matched, delivered to the house for roughly about $45, and you just can't beat that. So that's really going to be a great bed to build this NAS off of, at least for me. So let's move on to the second thing to look at. 2 pieces of software that you're going to need to have is something called HashTab. You can look up HashTab in Google. Go ahead and download and install that. And what it's going to do is add an extra tab in the Properties menu that will let you see the hash of a file. Next, you're going to need to download something called Rufus. And Rufus is a software, bear with me a second, that will let you write an ISO over to a USB. So this is another great software. I recommend downloading this and getting it staged before we move forward. Once all of that's done, we can go to the FreeNAS downloads page. And go ahead and start your download. And while that file is downloading, take a look at some of the other data here. Now, FreeNAS is going to be the software backbone of your home network, let's say. And you want to make absolutely sure, since all your data is on there, you could have sensitive stuff, family pictures, who knows what. You want to make sure that the version of FreeNAS you're getting hasn't been adjusted in any way, hasn't been hijacked and had stuff injected into it. So they give you this hash number. And after the download's complete, we can compare this number with the number of the file to make sure that this is legitimately from FreeNAS and again hasn't been adjusted in any way. So once your file is done downloading, go ahead to your download folder, right-click on FreeNAS, go to Properties, and if you've installed HashTab, you're going to see a new tab up here called File Hashes. Now what this is going to do is it's going to check out the hash of the file. You can go back to the Downloads page and copy this number, paste it in, and compare the two. Now if you get a red X, that means there's a problem. Okay, so let's see, what could this problem be? So I can immediately see what's going on here. We've only looked for the SHA-1 hash when the hash being called on the web page is SHA-256. So we can right-click in the File Hashes page here, go to Settings, unclick what we don't want, click what we do want, hit OK, and it'll rescan the file. We've got a green check. Now we know that this is a legitimate file downloaded directly from FreeNAS that hasn't been adjusted in any way. Next, we're going to have to take this ISO and move it over to some kind of install media. Now you can run this off of a DVD or you can run this off of a USB drive. I strongly recommend a USB drive. It's super simple, but you're going to need at least 8 gigabytes of storage space on that drive. So if you've got one, go ahead and install it into the computer now and launch Rufus. Rufus is a tool that's going to let us burn or copy over the ISO file and make it bootable on that USB drive. So make sure your proper device is selected. I've got this little 32 gig here. Go ahead and take the FreeNAS ISO, drag it over. You can see everything lines up, and we can hit start. It's going to give us a little warning that says, hey, all the data is going to be destroyed on here. You can go ahead and click OK. And then after the media finishes copying over to the USB drive, safely eject it, and we're going to move back over to the shop and start installing the software.
Okay, we've got our USB installed. So we got to make sure that we are booting off of that drive. All right, my first boot disk is the USB SanDisk. We've got the FreeNAS version on. So let's go ahead and boot off of that and get it installed. Now through various parts of this install procedure, I'm going to speed things up just for sake of time, but I want to let the camera roll just so you can see the whole process. Now this will auto-select boot FreeNAS installer, so we don't need to press anything. We're going to go ahead and select install. We're going to select the disk we would like to install to. So it's my 64 gigabyte SanDisk SSD. We're going to do a fresh install, and we're going to format the boot device. Now it's asking you to create your root password. Root is the highest level account you have on this box, so I absolutely recommend having a password here. And because this board's just a little bit older than some of the newest hardware out there, we're going to go ahead and leave it on BIOS versus UEFI. Now this part right here is asking if you would like to create a 16 gigabyte swap partition on your operating system drive. Now I have 64 gigs of space. We really only need 8 gigabytes available for the operating system, but if you ever run into an event where you run out of physical RAM, it'll move things over to the swap file for you, so that will work for us. Let's go with it. Okay, FreeNAS is installed successfully. Let's go ahead and reboot. and then we'll remove the USB media. Now, FreeNAS is almost entirely managed from a web terminal, but there are a couple things, well, one thing in particular that we want to do from the server-side screen before we move back to the office. So FreeNAS itself is pretty much all managed through the web interface, but there's a couple of things that you can do on this landing page, like adjust network interfaces, set up link aggregation, mess with things with VLAN or DNS, reset your password, reboot and shut down the system. So the initial IP that you get is assigned through DHCP, but this is a media server or a file server, so we're going to want to set that to static. So before we move over to a web interface, let's go ahead and configure the network interface. All right, so we are currently connected to EM0. Are we going to want to configure this for DHCP? Nope. Are we going to configure the IPv4? Absolutely. Interface name is EM0. That's asking us to put in an IP address we'd like to use. So for my network, I'm going to use 10.0.1.235 with a subnet mask of 255.255.255.0. We don't need to worry about IPv6. And that's it. We can see that we have a new IP address. This is set up to be static. Now we can move back over to the office and log into it through the web.
Back at our computer, let's go ahead and navigate to the IP address that we set on our server. Go ahead and log in with the root password you set up during installation. And you'll be placed on the dashboard. Now, compared to older versions of FreeNAS, this dashboard is very impressive. Quite a bit of data just right here that are easy to find, like CPU and memory analytics. You'll get a disk overview when disks are eventually set up. You get your different interfaces connected and their status. Just looks really refined and professional. So the first thing I can notice here is our time zone is wrong. So let's go ahead and get that set up. So I am in the Chicagoland area. All right, much better. So the overall goal of this is to set this little NAS up to give us some Windows shares. So the first thing we're going to need to do is assign a disk to the FreeNAS for use. So we'll go under Storage. Let's take a look at what disks it sees. All right, we got our boot disk. Let's go ahead and just give it a little description. All right, and then we've got the disk we're going to use for data. Now, eventually, I'm going to have this set up with a RAID controller for 2 terabyte drives under RAID 10. But for this example, we just got a single drive here. So the way things work in this environment is disks need to be added to something called pools. And you can think of this as adding like a hard drive or your computer that doesn't have any formatting or any kind of partition on it yet. So let's go ahead and add a pool. We're going to create a new pool because nothing exists yet. And we're going to select our disk, the ADA1. Now we noticed from disks before that ADA0 is boot, so we know for sure that we're selecting the right disk.
And then with that added, we'll give it a name. And create. Now again, this is like a hard drive that's been added to your computer that does not have any partitioning or formatting yet. So if we want to be able to use it for anything, we're going to have to create some data sets. So we'll add our first data set, and this will be, the best way to think about this is this will be individual partitions on this drive that we can map to network folders. So the first network folder we'll call public. All these settings are all right. Go ahead and save. And let's make another one. And we'll call this, say, projects. So now we've got our drive. And the best way to think about it, like I said, is we've got two partitions set up. But we're going to need to make those viewable to Windows. So right now these are just drives that exist on the NAS, but we need to set them up as shares. So we can close the storage section, come down to shares. Since I am doing this for Windows, we'll make an SMB share. And now we can add those data sets. So for example, we'll drill down into Gluttony. We'll pick public. Enable shadow copy is fine. And we'll hit save. They're asking if it's okay to start the SMB service on FreeNAS. Absolutely. SMB has been enabled. And we'll configure these ACLs later. All right, let's add projects. So now we've got our two folders. Now if we try to access these shares, we'll notice that it's asking for network credentials. That's because we haven't set up any users or groups yet. So switch back to FreeNAS, come up to the accounts, and starting, we're going to create two groups. Now we've got two shares we're setting up, public and projects, so we're going to create a group for each of them. All right, next we're going to create a user. Let's call this user test. All right, we'll go back down to our shares. We'll edit the ACLs. First thing we're going to do is we're going to assign the group we created to the folder. So this is the projects folder. We'll assign it the projects group. And we're going to mark this one as restricted. Let's say, hey, you've got some projects that you don't want other people messing around with. Hit save. Now for public, we'll go in and we'll edit the ACLs. We'll set that group to public. And we're going to make this one open so anybody who can log in can access it. Let's go ahead and restart the service. And then try to access those files again. All right, now we see our two network shares. Let's check out public. We can get into it. Let's see if we have the permissions to write anything. Fantastic. Let's go ahead and try to access projects. Oh, what is this? We don't have permissions to access this folder. Let's see what's going on. So if we go to our share, and take a look at the ACLs on projects, we can see it's assigned to the projects group. Let's go back and look at the groups.
members. There's no members here. So let's assign access to test, which is our test user. Restart our SMB service again. And then see if we can access those files. Hooray! Now we can get into projects. See if we can write to it. Great! Alright, so that covers just about the basics of how to set up groups and users and ACLs for your Windows share. But here's one more interesting tidbit you guys might be interested in. First off, we're logged into this share as our test user. So let's back out and let's close those connections. So we can see that we've got a connection right here, and that's been logged into by test. With that connection closed, the next time we try to access any of those shares, it's going to look for new credentials. So let's go back over to our FreeNAS box and add one more account. So if you have a local Windows account, and yes, I know Microsoft is making it harder and harder to have one of those these days, but if you have a local Windows account, you can add your local Windows credentials. The same username and password. Add that user to the relevant groups. Start and stop our service. And we will try to access those files using my already logged in Windows credentials. Fantastic. I can access public. Write to it. And I've added my Windows credentials to the projects group. And I have no problems accessing that either. Okay, so we've covered how to set up a disk, how to create a pool, users, groups, permissions. Let's set a host name. Let's give us something to resolve other than an IP address when trying to connect to the server. Switching back to the FreeNAS page, we'll go to Network, Global Configurations, and under host name, we'll type something in a little cooler, like Skynet. Hit save. Now before this will really take effect, we're going to need to reboot the server. Now that the server is rebooted, let's go ahead and try to navigate to it by its host name. And there you have it. We have access to our files.
If you've been following along, by now you've got a couple of drives on your network that you can reach, so congratulations. Now obviously this is just the tip of the iceberg. FreeNAS is incredibly powerful and can do so much more, so I highly recommend looking at the manual. I'll put the link to the manual and some of the software I showed in the description of this video. Anyways guys, I hope you learned something. If you did, consider hitting that like button, possibly subscribe, and we'll see you on the next video.